Welcome back to phi105. Here's your second lecture. It's on a reading called Egoisms by David Shoemaker. The first egoism that Shoemaker discusses is psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is not a moral theory. Instead, we'll be looking at psychological egoism in comparison to the moral theory of ethical egoism. Psychological egoism essentially is the theory that all actions are done solely or ultimately for the sake of self-interest. This might sound a little strange to you. To disprove psychological egoism, someone could offer examples of apparent selflessness or altruism, such as Mother Teresa's life's work. To solve this problem, a proponent of psychological egoism can offer one of two more specific formulations of the theory. First, there's a formulation in terms of one's desires, but Shoemaker thinks the first formulation is ultimately empty. Read about this on page 21 and 22. Second, there's a formulation of experiential psychological egoism. Shoemaker thinks this formulation is just false. Read about his position on this one on pages 22 and 23. In any case, it will be difficult to defend psychological egoism. Even if psychological egoism seems true to you, you must produce evidence to support it and ways of testing it in order to verify the theory. Because psychological egoism says that all human actions are motivated by self-interest alone, even one counterexample, such as Mother Teresa, disproves psychological egoism in general. The psychological egoism theory is a descriptive theory about the way people actually act. It is not a moral theory. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is a moral theory. This is because ethical egoism describes how people should act. In other words, it is a normative theory. It provides norms for human behavior. What is ethical egoism then? Shoemaker gives its definition on page 24. On ethical egoism, an act is right if and only if it produces a state of affairs whose consequences for the agent are no worse than the consequences of alternative states of affairs producible by any other action the agent could have performed. In plain English, ethical egoism means that each person morally ought to do whatever maximizes the consequences for only herself. Take a minute to think about what ethical egoism would require in terms of giving to charity, for instance. Does this theory seem good to you? We can use the criteria from the last reading to evaluate ethical egoism systematically. On pages 25 through 30, Shoemaker explains why ethical egoism actually seems to fare quite well on each of the 6 criteria given previously. However, ethical egoism is not without its problems. Shoemaker uses the 7th criteria of publicity to describe the major problem facing ethical egoism. In a nutshell, ethical egoism in its simplest form cannot be publicized or publicly advocated because a good practitioner of ethical egoism needs other people to think that he will keep promises, for instance. Then he will actually keep the promise if and only if it maximizes his consequences, even if that means betraying another. So if everyone is following ethical egoism, then no one can maximize her consequences, as that typically requires dependable cooperation with others. You can read about the publicity problem in detail on pages 30 through 33. Now that we've seen some pros and cons of ethical egoism, let's try to think about the deontic verdicts ethical egoism might issue. Previously, I mentioned gifts to charity. What might ethical egoism require in this regard? What might ethical egoism say about the death penalty? Gay marriage? Abortion? Think about these issues and share your thoughts on the discussion board.